Hello, I'm Terrence McNally, and welcome to today's podcast. Where would Facebook be without friends? What would Twitter, Amazon, Yelp, and any network whose value is based on our data be without us, sharing photos and feelings, making purchases, registering opinions? Just as TV was always selling eyeballs, more than programming or advertising, today's online giants are selling us, our visits, our clicks, our shares. In his new book, Who Owns the Future, today's guest, JARON Lanier, writes, quote, "At the height of its power, Kodak employed more than 140,000 people and was worth $28 billion. They even invented the first digital camera. Today, Kodak is bankrupt, and the new face of digital photography is Instagram. When Instagram was sold to Facebook for $1 billion in 2012, it employed only 13 people. Where did all those jobs disappear? And what happened to the wealth that all those middle-class jobs created?" He believes the emerging business model, in which companies with relatively few employees profit off the participation of all of us, could doom any hope of a rebirth of the middle class. Lanier wants to solve a problem that not many are talking about, and he envisions a radical solution, quote, "a highly humanistic economy, one that will reward people for the valuable information they share with networks and the companies that control and profit from them. By, quote, monetizing more of what's valuable from ordinary people, who turn out to be the uncompensated sources of the data that make networks valuable in the first place, we can create a better future." Here on Free Forum, we explore the lives, the work, and the ideas of individuals that I suspect have pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. We look at new, innovative, provocative approaches to business, environment, health, science, politics, and media. It's all based on the fact that I believe we can do better, and I want to find out how. Time magazine named JARON Lanier one of the 100 most influential people in the world in 2010. He's also one of the 100 remarkable people of the Global Business Network. He either coined or popularized the term virtual reality, founded the first company to sell virtual reality products, and developed cutting-edge medical imaging and surgical techniques. Lanier is one of the premier designers and engineers at work today. He's linked with UC Berkeley and Microsoft. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, Discover, the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Harper's, Sciences, Wired, Scientific American. He's been a fellow at the International Computer Science Institute in Berkeley, interdisciplinary scholar in residence at UC Berkeley, innovator in residence at USC Annenberg, and partner architect at Microsoft Research since 2009. Also a musician and composer, Lanier has performed with artists as diverse as Yoko Ono, Philip Glass, Ornette Coleman, George Clinton, and Oza Motley. He's the author of You Are Not a Gadget, a Manifesto, and his latest, Who Owns the Future. Welcome to Free Forum, JARON Lanier.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Okay, I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the ideas and the work that we talk about. Now, I've mentioned a few highlights, a few honors, this and that, but can you briefly bring to life for people your path to the work that you're doing today? Feel free to mention mentors, turning points, moments of decision. We've got time for you to weave this story.
Well, I think the place I'd begin is when I was a teenager in the 70s, and I first came in contact with some of the figures who were creating what we now find familiar, this digital world. And I have to say that at that time, there was this electric feeling, which not very many people were exposed to, this feeling that we were going to really improve the world. It was an extraordinary feeling. And of course, there was kind of a thrill of being in an in club and sort of feeling like we were ahead of the curve. But there was also a kind of an open-hearted quality to it, because the idea wasn't to stay an in club. The idea wasn't to remain some sort of elite, but we really thought we were bringing the world something that would benefit everybody. And the basic idea was, if you look at the history of humanity, you see this repeated phenomenon where some clever, wily, and not so generous person gets power, or some group of people get power, at the expense of others, and often horrible violence and exploitation ensue, and you see it again and again, and the names change. Sometimes it might be a church or a communist regime or a nationalistic cause or whatever, or an ethnic cause, but the same thing just keeps on happening. And whenever you look at this outbreak of what we can all call evil, the number one thing the evildoer wants to do is control the flow of information. There's always this idea of controlling what other people can think, what they can have access to. So what we thought is if you create this digital tool that's really global and really connected so information can flow around, we might finally have a way to address this age-old problem with something practical. It was kind of a very nerdy technical approach to evil, you know. and you know what? I think there have been some instances where it's kind of panned out that way, but overall, you know, I have to say, since around the turn of the century, I've been feeling a sense of disappointment that maybe others wouldn't feel who weren't part of the initial enthusiasm, because, you know, I'm not satisfied. I feel like what we've got is not nearly good enough. I don't want a world where, you know, the government is super enabled to spy on everybody. I don't want a world where the middle class is disappearing. I don't want a world where we're creating this new plutocracy of ultra nerds, you know, of whom I'm one, I must say, but I still think that this isn't the world I want to live in. It's not the world I want to leave to my children and their descendants. And so I haven't lost my initial enthusiasm. I'm still kind of, for better or for worse, a technologist who believes technology can help. But I also feel like we have to be honest about what our results are if we're going to be of any use. And we have to admit, you know, part of what's happened with the digital revolution is really not so hot, and we need to really rethink it. So that's what I'm up to.
Yeah, no, very clearly. And it's interesting to hear you say that, because I remember, although I have not been in that world, I knew people who were, and I remember that sort of idealism that now, as you've pointed out in your books, in your writing and everything, that idealism was a little mixed up. In other words, part of that idealism was the notion that information was free, and some of the things that have turned out to become problems. Am I right?
Well, you know, what's funny is that for the first couple of decades, or maybe even the first 25 years of the digital revolution, information wasn't supposed to be free in an economic sense. You know, going back to the very first concept of a digital network where people could collaborate, which is Ted Nelson's model in 1960, which he called Xanadu. The idea was that there'd be some sort of micropayment system where people would get actual money out of what they did online. And the reason that was part of the original idea was clear enough, you know, which is, if you're going to keep to a market economy and you're like paying money for rent and all that, but meanwhile, technology's getting better and more stuff's becoming part of an information economy. If you declare the information economy to be not part of the market, but other stuff is still part of the market, then in a way, the most advanced people will be put at risk because they'll be denied the benefits of being in the market. You know, I mean, like you can't make a mixed system that discriminates like that. You really have to do, if you're going to do a market economy, you kind of have to really do it. But there was even more to it than that, because Ted Nelson, who was the first person to propose digital networks, was actually a child of Hollywood figures and had seen firsthand how union movements had created a way for people to make a living when they might not otherwise have. You know, the whole world of screenwriting and acting, they could have been racist to the bottom, just like we see today with, you know, online stuff like giving rides on Uber or working on Mechanical Turk or something. They could have been virtually unpaid, but a union movement kind of created a sense of a living wage. And we always think of the top movie stars and how much they're paid, and maybe they're overpaid. But what we forget is that there was a huge middle class also created out of what union movements were able to do with creative professions. And so his vision of it was, you know, when we move into the information age, we should preserve this idea of supporting a middle class. We should preserve this idea that people have a means of sustenance for what they do that's a real living wage and not just a race to the bottom. So that was always there. It only went away kind of in the late 70s and in the 80s, and very much so in the 90s. And it went away for a whole bunch of weird reasons. But you know, it wasn't part of the start. It's something that was added later.
That linkage to Hollywood is very interesting. You know, we are here in Los Angeles at KPFK, and I myself was one of those middle-class people in the entertainment industry for about 2 decades. And you're right. The movies, the TV shows, all of that would not exist without them, whether the folks at home know that or not, but they are able to survive job to job because of what unions have done. This is Freeform. I'm Terrence McNally, speaking with JARON Lanier, computer scientist, composer, and author, credited with coining the term virtual reality. We're talking about his latest book, Who Owns the Future? And you can learn more at JaronLanier.com. That's JaronLanier.com. Let me ask you one other thing that's a personal question, which is, you started out in the computer world as a young man, and it seems to me that the world of high tech and high data seems always fueled by the young. What has it been like to mature within that world as the young upstarts and whippersnappers drop out of college and start new, either new ideas or new companies and so on?
There's a joke I tell about that sometimes, which is when I turned 40, which was right at the turn of the century, I happened to be lecturing at the computer science department at Stanford. And this freshman kid, who might have been 17 or 18, came up to me and looked at me and said, "Jaron Lanier, you're still alive?" And, sort of like, well, oh my God. Yeah, it is kind of a world that celebrates youth. Certain kinds of math tend to happen more in young minds, it seems. For me, the experience of growing, I don't know if we can I'm 53 now. I don't know if that counts as older, really, but I still kind of feel immature. I still feel like a kid, but, it's been pretty...
Neoteny, right?
Yeah, neoteny, that's right. Neoteny means you can
Youthful
still be...
characteristics into older age.
Yeah, you get to be immature forever. No, I it's treated me pretty well, I have to say. I feel well respected in my community and in Silicon Valley, and it hasn't been an issue, and I'm grateful for that.
Okay. Your 2 latest books, You Are Not a Gadget and Who Owns the Future, have drawn reactions from some that you've turned your back on a world that you helped create. And I was reminded when I was looking at this of a previous guest, Sherry Turkle of MIT, and she's been studying this for, as long as anyone and has that trilogy of books. But when she came out with the 3rd one, Alone Together, the critics, the people said, you've left us, you've turned on us, what happens? Can you talk a bit about both your evolution, which you've talked about a bit already, and that reaction?
Well, there's a sociological observation I'll make, which is that the people who have been around the digital revolution for a while are not the ones who say you've turned away from us, because the whole thing started with a very experimental mindset. There wasn't an orthodoxy at the beginning. There were all kinds of different ideas and openness, and our thinking was agile. This idea of an orthodoxy only comes about among the followers. So, what I would advise somebody is, if you look at something, whether it's my writing or Sherry Turkle's or anybody, or in some other field, and you say, oh my God, this person's turned away from what we think of as our path, this idea that we all share, that we feel good about, that's an orthodoxy, and you should really question it. You're becoming a follower. It's not a healthy way for you to think. You're not fully empowering yourself. So, think from first principles. That's no guarantee that any critic is right, but, this idea that you should follow something and that even the idea that it's possible to turn against it is just absurd. There shouldn't be any orthodoxy there. This isn't about ideology. This should be about what works and what doesn't work. And I'm unsatisfied with the empirical results from the actual real world results of what we've done. That's my only problem. If the real world results were satisfying, I wouldn't have any problem with it. It's not about ideology. If you let it be about ideology, you're kind of diminishing your own intelligence. Not a great way to be.
Let me ask one other thing, because if I don't do it now, I'll probably not get to it. You're, as I mentioned, a longtime musician and composer, a collector of obscure, archaic instruments, which might strike some people. Here you are on the cutting edge of one field, and yet you have a passionate interest in the deep past. How do you find, and take it back as far as you want, that your interest in music and pre-modern acoustic music has affected your thinking in your life?
Oh, gosh. I get asked this question. In all respect, I've gotten asked this question a lot of times, and I'm not really sure what the answer is. I can tell you a few answers. I mean, one of them is that a part of my professional career has been about user interface, the virtual reality stuff. You know, how do you connect to a machine? What are the most interesting ways to do it? And by far, the most advanced user interfaces ever created are the musical instruments. They're the most agile, the most expressive, the ones where you can really become virtuosic, the ones that have cultural feeling embedded in them. You know, I mean, we haven't done anything digital that even approaches them. So if I'm interested in that, it's natural that I'd want to surround myself with the very best examples and be able to learn from them. So that part seems obvious enough. But there's another thing too, which is music reminds me of the limits of our knowledge, I suppose, because music is a kind of meaning that we really don't understand. We don't know what music's for. We don't understand the interior of it. We pretend to. There's a tendency to overclaim in certain types of fashionable scholarship, but really it's a little beyond us. And I feel even the music a musician makes is often a little bit beyond the understanding of that musician. And there's a kind of a humility, there's a kind of a humble stance you have to take on to be a good musician. Your public persona might be arrogant or whatever, but just in order to be a good musician, you actually have to kind of, you know, surrender to the fact that it's a bit beyond you. And that quality is I think, lacking in technical culture. And I would be terrified of losing it if I ever moved away from music.
Thank you. That's a really interesting perspective. And I would have to agree that even the music that one creates is in a way intangible and ineffable to the person who created it, if it really rises to beautiful music.
Now, see, you've agreed with everything I've said. You have to snap out of that.
I'll work on it. Thanks,
Okay, good.
As you said, the turn of the century, you began to see things a little differently. You began to kind of take a little more critical tack. Did you first go public with that new perspective in the Wired article, One Half of a Manifesto? And what was going on at that moment? You know,
there were a couple of different strains of doubt that were converging for me. I'd always had a doubt that was sort of, we could call it a metaphysical doubt, which is there's a philosophy that goes along with technical culture approximately. You know, I'm not saying that everybody agrees precisely, but roughly speaking, there are a lot of people who want to think of reality as a giant computer and culture as a problem-solving activity, and they have a sense of manifest destiny that's similar to optimizing a program. And also a feeling that it's leading towards some sort of orgasmic destiny, which can be called the singularity, and is similar to the idea of the rapture in some kinds of American Christianity. And that whole thing, I felt, was leading us. I don't really care what people believe. I don't feel like it's my business, but I felt it was influencing our technical designs in a way that was making them worse. And I still feel that way, actually. So I'd started to write about that. I suppose in the 90s at some point. But what really turned me around on the economic implications was around the turn of the century, when Silicon Valley discovered what, you know, Wall Street had already discovered, which is that you could use a big computer to just calculate wealth out of the world if you get everybody's data. You know, about the time that happened, and in Silicon Valley it was called advertising, but it was basically the same idea as what had happened in Wall Street. At that time, I was having to participate almost on a weekly basis on special charity concerts at jazz clubs to bail out very well-known and cherished figures in the music world who in the previous economy would have done well enough for themselves that they wouldn't have needed it. And it was starting to become such a regular occurrence that this or that famous, you know, celebrated, cherished, beloved figure needed an operation and had lost their insurance and was stuck. And I just realized after a certain number of these that it was not just a set of, you know, a set of exceptions. It was the new rule, and it was totally unacceptable. It was totally heartbreaking, and it was totally a failure of the way we were running our society. And I started to realize that our utopia wasn't working. It might be working for some of us. Certainly for me personally, it's been very rewarding, but it wasn't working for enough of us in the right way, so I just couldn't support it anymore.
Very good. This is Freeforum. I'm Terrence McNally, and I'm speaking with JARON Lanier, computer scientist, composer, author, credited with coining the term virtual reality, and we're talking about his latest book, Who Owns the Future? You can learn more at JaronLanier.com. Another thing around the turn of the century, you were one of the first, I think, to point to the welcoming of anonymous commenters on websites as a danger to political discourse, a danger to civility. How did you come to that point of view, and how have you seen that, both that phenomena and your response over the years?
Yeah, it's not anonymous commenting per se, but it's a whole host of design features where there's an economic incentive to get people to click more so that they'll see more ads and present more data so that a model of them can be refined to make them more susceptible to ads. And what it does is it creates unconsidered participation for the benefit of the remote server that's creating the behavioral models of the people, to manipulate them. But what it looks like at ground level often is various forms of what we might call trolling these days, or just times when people start to behave badly. And I want to try to draw a fine line here, and it is tricky to keep to the right side of it. It's not my interest to become a scold. I don't want to tell. I actually think a little bit of trolling is not a bad thing. I think being cranky and critical sometimes is not a bad thing. I think asking everybody to be nice all the time is a bad thing. I think there should be variety in human relationships, and I think demanding that they always be comfortable is probably a bad idea. But on the other hand, I do think that there's been a real excess of people motivated to be jerks, online. And there are a lot of topics where I think people have been just driven into a jerk versus jerk kind of dynamic that's really, really lowered the quality of discourse. America's always had a sort of a horrible divide, which was led to one of the worst wars. The Civil War was a horrible thing, and we're still fighting it in a sense. And so there's nothing new about that, but there's a sense in which we're not even hearing each other. It's really wild. Like, if you read the diatribes and the rhetoric of the Civil War, it wasn't any less mean-spirited than what you'd find now, certainly. Obviously, we were going out and killing each other. And yet, I think there was more acknowledgement of what the other side was saying. There certainly wasn't agreement, but at least there was some kind of perception. And now I'm not even sure there's that. There's a kind of a blind embracing of just enmity. And it's weird. It's sort of like an abstract way of being I'm trying to avoid words that I shouldn't say on the radio, but there's this abstract way of being creepy that I just think doesn't get us anywhere. So I find it bothersome, and of course I find it bothersome that young people find that and think it's normal. But I don't want to become some sort of scold.
I don't want to keep putting you in that position, but I think what you've done, and here I'll end up agreeing with you again, is that I think you've taken a perspective, a step back, that says some of the things that just seem to be part and parcel of the internet or of connectivity deserve to be questioned. You did a powerful interview with Chris Hedges back in 2010, which I guess was around the time of You're Not a Gadget. And I'm going to read a couple of things you said at that point. You said, humans, like many other species, have a cognitive switch that permits us to be individuals or members of a mob. And once we enter the confines of a clan, even a virtual clan, it possesses dynamics that appeal to the basest instincts within us. And it seems to me that links to that anonymous trolling and anonymous venom and all that sort of thing. One of the things that I find, even when I blog or I put up a podcast, is so often you go down and you'll find after 3 or 4 comments, it begins to be some sort of a rant that has nothing to do with anything that was what the original supposed stimulus was. And it just seems to be someone in a trench that they scream from, and there they are screaming from it again because they found a place where they could.
Yeah, well, I've also noticed especially young people being drawn into, when you're online, there's this almost, it's like being in a video game, but it's a video game of the ego, a video game of one's own psychology, very raw, where you're looking for affirmation. And there's sites that are willing to give you strokes. You know, you can get a ton of, I don't know, a ton of likes or whatever just for posting a link. And so, and I suppose that's fine. But what happens is that there are always people out in the environment who take advantage of that. And then you see, especially kids being drawn into this new form of abuse, which can be pretty bad, you know, and I find myself a little torn talking about this. This is a bit more Sherry Turkle's turf, because I'm trying to really address the big questions that I feel like I can help with. Maybe this is just another chapter in the endless saga of humans being jerks, you know, and
in whatever medium they find.
In whatever, you know, I to tell you the truth, I find it a little hard to come to the ground truth on that. But, you know, the aspect of it that I do feel really confident in is the economic aspect. Let's say if people are being jerks, they're not getting paid for being jerks. Whereas, you know, it used to be you could become like some kind of nasty stand-up comic and at least get paid for it, you know.
So we're close to the halfway point. I'm Terrence McNally. As I said, I'm speaking with JARON Lanier, computer scientist, composer, author. We're talking about his latest book, and we're really going to jump into this now. Who Owns the Future? You can learn more at JaronLanier.com. This is Freeforum on KPFK 90.7 FM, 98.7 in Santa Barbara, streaming and podcasting at kpfk.org. For this week's conversation and many others, as well as articles and transcripts, and to join me in pursuit of a world that just might work, go to TerrenceMcNally.net, TerrenceMcNally, TerrenceMcNally.net, or aworldthatjustmightwork.com, to the same website. If you want to receive my weekly email announcing who's going to be on, what we're going to talk about, and 4 or 5 articles of background, you can sign up at my site or by emailing me at TeMcNally, TeMcNally, at mac.com. You can also subscribe and listen to Freeform podcast on iTunes. You can check out Freeform with Terrence McNally on Facebook and follow me on Twitter at McNallyTerrence. Okay, so the thing that really struck me and why I reached out to talk with you was the economic perspective that you take in Who Owns the Future. And one of the things I found fascinating is that you take, a step backwards and talk about the fact that the 20th century did something about jobs and did something about the middle class that, in a way, as you point out, was just a social construct. They began to say that you didn't have to do backbreaking, horrible toil to have a job. And so do if you would, you talk about the evolution of work and labor and jobs as a 3-act play. Act 1, the 19th century, Act 2, the 20th, Act 3, the 21st. Could you lay that out for folks, because it sets a really good context for what we're going to talk about?
Oh, sure. I'd be delighted to. So, yeah, it's a melodrama in 3 acts, if you like. So we'll start in the 19th century. And, you know, if you read 19th century literature, one of the things that's striking is that there was much more consciousness and consideration of the far future than we have today. Today, the future is a bit of a fuzzy thing to us, and most of our science fiction is just bleak and dystopian. But in the 19th century, it was much more crisp and present and also hugely part of popular culture. So a couple of the key points were the Luddites, of course. The Luddite riots were not about people hating technology, but about people worried about losing their jobs because of changing technology. The next point I'd mention is the writings of Karl Marx, which ended up, of course, hugely influencing the world. And Marx was very much following on the experience of the Luddites and was essentially a technology writer in his early career. In his writings starting in the 1840s, you see really a technology writer trying to grapple with the human role as machines would get better and better. I don't know how many popular songs you remember that were 19th century hits, but one of them might be the Ballad of John Henry, which is about a guy who's competing with a robot that lays down railroad tracks and is able to win, but only by dying of exhaustion at the end. The whole genre of science fiction arose in the 19th century and was initially and continues to be about whether people will become obsolete or not. There's 2 kinds of science fiction stories. In one, we're made obsolete by meeting fancy aliens. You know, that happens in 2001, although arguably 2001 is actually an example of the more common script, which is that we make ourselves obsolete because of our own machines. And that's the one that just recurs again and again with the Terminator movies and the Matrix movies and Inception and Battlestar Galactica and over and over and over again. And that's how science fiction started, as a way of expressing anxiety about the fate of people in a world of improving technology. So we're still living essentially in the 19th century framework in the world of culture that was invented then to deal with robot anxiety, if you like. So then what happened in the 20th century is things turned out much better than had been feared in the 19th century. One of the things that you always hear about, if somebody is worried about technology making jobs go away, the usual retort is, oh, but what about those buggy whips? Everybody was afraid that the decline of the buggy whip industry would lead to a loss of jobs. And yeah, it's funny. The buggy whip industry was huge in Rochester, New York, and it did go down, and those jobs were replaced by the photography industry. Kodak and Polaroid were there. And now with those fallen and Instagram coming up, we're hitting some sort of an end of the road. We're hitting a change where the replacement isn't creating as many jobs. So what happened in the 20th century to create those jobs? Well, it was, as you say, a social construct in a way. When automobiles replaced horse-drawn vehicles, when the buggy whip industry was going down, one of the things that was apparent is that it's a lot more pleasant to drive a car than deal with horses. Now, personally, I love horses, and I've enjoyed working with them, but to have to work with whatever horse is given to you as your job would not be pleasant at all. They can kick. You have to deal with their feet and brushing them and the poop and the feeding. And it's like a whole thing. A car with an engine is just a pleasure in comparison. It's automatic, what's called an automobile. And so it was natural to ask the question, well, if we're not dealing with horses anymore, why are we even paying these guys? Why do we pay Teamsters? Why do we pay somebody to drive a cab or a truck when it's actually really nice and we all like driving? Well, maybe in LA with the traffic jams, you don't so much anymore, but in principle, we all like driving. Cars are great. They're toys. Everybody loves cars. They're an opportunity for design. They're an opportunity for culture. I mean, everybody loves cars. And so why are we paying people to drive them? And the answer is a really interesting one. And it came from two directions that converged, in two directions that had no sympathy for each other. One was the labor movement. And one way to think of the labor movement is that it asserted even if what people do is not miserable, is not life-threatening, is not smelly, is not disgusting, even if it's really not that bad, they can still get paid for it. And that's the fundamental assertion of the labor movement, because otherwise you get a race to the bottom in terms of wages and all. And then, but the other surprising source of it was from industrialists. So Henry Ford, the great early entrepreneur of automobiles, who, by the way, was an incredible racist creep in other aspects. I mean, he's not an admirable figure, but he was practical. And what he realized is that you can't have a market economy without a customer class. There's not going to be nobody to buy the stuff. So he was adamant that factories had to pay workers enough to buy the products that they were making, or else the whole thing would never take off. So he made sure to price the Model T low enough for people to afford it, but he also very strongly encouraged industrialists, and also practiced himself, fair living wage, scales, so that he could start to create a culture where there'd be customers for the cars he wanted to sell. And so you had this weird kind of unacknowledged collaboration between industrialists that understood they needed to nurture a customer class and trade unions. And those things together created this construct that, even if it's not miserable, you can still earn a wage. But, in order to do that, something awkward had to happen, which is some artificial barrier had to be created to prevent a race to the bottom. And that might be union membership or some sort of special license, or so taxi cab medallion systems or something like that. Academic tenure is another example, even though its origins go much, much further back. So there was a bit of an artificiality and awkwardness to how it all was done, but that's what happened. And that's the thing we've rejected in the 21st century.
Right. And so the Act 3, the 21st century, have you asked yourself the deepest question, which is why, if Henry Ford, for all his other failures, could be both a pragmatist and a visionary and set a standard that sort of America, and then, of course, the GI Bill, sort of ensured the next 50 years, why that got lost.
Yeah, it is really interesting. I think there are a combination of reasons. I mean, I think part of it is a lack of awareness of history. I mean, I was around both the Wall Street when they discovered how they could use big data just to milk money out of the world, and also Silicon Valley. In Silicon Valley, it was a very sweet guy who kind of jumped over the threshold, who was Sergey Brin from Google, and great guy, really lovely man, actually. And but at the time, the problem is it's very hard to see the whole system at once. Like if you're just thinking as a consumer, or as just like a person, you're thinking, wow, it's great. I can get cheaper rides by using a service like Uber. Why should I pay a taxi company? I can get free files. Why should I pay a cable company to, for music or video or whatever? I can get free stuff or cheaper stuff. Why should I pay? And you only see the part that's the benefit, but you're not thinking about what kind of society will be left after all that to provide you with an income in whatever it is that you do. And similarly, if you're an entrepreneur with a great big computer, you're thinking, wow, I can give people free stuff and I can make money by just calculating ways for advertisers to put messages in front of them, and doesn't everybody win? Except in the big picture, no, everybody does not win. Everybody loses, because you're gradually removing human activity from the economy by calling it free to create all this bait for advertising. So very gradually you're destroying more and more wealth in the system by taking it off the books. So, it's very hard, because in any given role, you don't see the big picture, and at any given moment in history, you might not remember the cycles that have happened in the past. So you have to really step back to see it all.
Yeah, it's interesting. So often I've been doing this show for 15 years, and so often it comes down to, we need to see the big picture, we need to see long term, whether backwards or forwards. And it is that inability to see either the big picture or the long term that, to me, is, almost, you can find a piece of that in almost every big problem we face. One of the things that you talk about, the Googles, the Amazons, the Facebooks, is you call them siren servers. What does that term mean?
Well, a siren server is the biggest and most effective computer on a network. So going back again to our old ideologies, back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, it was very common thinking that, and it still is common thinking today, that if you just open up all the information, that should democratize things and should benefit everybody. And you see that in Wikipedia-like phenomena and MOOCs, the massive online classroom movement, and WikiLeaks, all these other things. This idea, just make all the information available. Now, there's a fatal flaw in that idea, which I kind of feel like an idiot to not have seen it beforehand, but somehow I don't think any of us saw it. And that is that even if everybody is sharing information openly and everybody hypothetically has access to the same information, whoever has the biggest computer will be able to do more with that information than anybody else. So it actually creates an inequity. So, right now, you have access to most of the information Google does. Hypothetically, you could go around scraping the open internet and doing something with it. But they have a massive network of city-size computers, to process it. So do some of their competitors, like Microsoft, which is where my lab is based now. And so those of us who have access to the big computers can outcompute ordinary people. And when you can outcompute somebody, you can just kind of turn on a spigot that dribbles out increased wealth and power. I mean, it's just extraordinary and creepy. And as I say, I'm a beneficiary of it, but I just see it not being a sustainable game.
Right. Now, one of the examples outside of the sort of the computer area, well, outside of the computer area, but absolutely dependent on the computer area, is the fast trading on Wall Street. That's really very much the same thing as what you're talking about with these other companies, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, Wall Street got the bug pretty early on. The two entities actually that figured out that you could use big computers to just kind of compute wealth and power from the world. Well, there's three. The intelligence agencies of the world got it. Walmart understood it early, and Wall Street firms. Those are the three source points. All of those actually got it before Silicon Valley did, strangely enough, because I think Silicon Valley always had a kind of an innocence and dreaminess about it compared to the other guys. But the easiest way to explain it which I like to use, is the insurance business, where before big data, before big computers came along, insurance companies grew their business by trying to insure as many people as possible. But once you had big data and you could predict individually what would be likely to happen to people, you could grow your business by insuring fewer people, by trying to not insure people who would need the insurance. And there's a story I tell, which the publisher wouldn't let me include in the book, which is I was once talking about computing I have had a consulting career with all kinds of different entities, and the guy who was at that time the CEO of the largest health insurance concern in the US, this is in the 90s, was having this epiphany before our eyes. We were saying, wow, with this computing, I really don't have to insure the people who will need it. It's a completely different way to think about it. And at that moment, there was this horrible rushing and rumbling and booming sound, and then like this earthquake and this explosion. And it was completely unlike anything I'd experienced. And it turned out there was a meteor strike right next to us.
Oh my God.
I mean, I've been around earthquakes and lightning and all kinds of things, but I've never been at a meteor strike site before. So what I will say is, if you're a young astronomy student and you want to study meteors, you need to get an American health insurance executive and tether them next to your instruments, then stand back and wait.
They will attract. This is Freeform. I'm Terrence McNally. The other voice is JARON Lanier, and we're talking about the ideas in his latest book, Who Owns the Future? You can learn a lot more at JaronLanier.com. Really, where we go from here, there are the siren servers who have learned how to make enormous fortunes from the data which is considered free and, in some sense, if free, worthless. A quote, one of your quotes is, you say the informal way of getting by, which is what we have, is an informal sort of economy among most people, just doesn't tide you over when you get sick, and it doesn't let you raise kids, and it doesn't let you grow old, and it's not biologically real. And this is the problem that we're facing right now, right? You also say the online services that would survive would be the ones that can add value to the data that people are providing anyway, because otherwise these siren servers, these companies say it's free and it's worthless. Your solution to that problem is a radical change, isn't it?
Right. So I should say another part of the old idealism was that someday technology would become so good and so cheap that it wouldn't matter who was rich and who was poor, that there would just be free robots to do your heart surgery or whatever. And what I've realized as we're starting to build a more high-tech society based on information economy is that that particular prediction is not panning out. It really does matter whether you're rich or poor. It affects what education you'll have access to. It affects how free you'll be. It affects your health, your life expectancy. It's a really big deal. So, the relevance of relative wealth is becoming greater, not lesser. So that prediction is so far proving to be false. And I believe that that's the way it is. I mean, I think we were just wrong about that. So if I can give another example that I have found helpful, one of the free services that you can use that's really used to pull you in so that you can be observed, so that behavioral models of you kept in secret can be refined in order to manipulate you better. But this free bait is a free translation. So you can upload a document in English and get it back in Spanish, which is amazing. On first glance, you might look at it and you might say, wow, this is this free thing. And in a way, the problem here is the inability of computer science to accept reality as we've learned it to be. Because what had happened is way back in the 1950s, there was this dream that we'd be able to build electronic brains that would be able to do things like translate documents. But it turned out that it's never really worked that way, that what you actually need is what we call big data, which is a huge database. And so what actually happens when a document is translated automatically is tons and tons, literally millions of documents that were translated by real people are correlated with your document. So you find turns of phrase and fragments that are similar in previously translated documents, and then you pastiche together, you mash up those previous translations, and that's the new magic translation you get. And the thing to notice there is that wherever there's big data, there's a big crowd of people that created that data, and they're behind a curtain or pretending they don't exist. They're disenfranchised, right? And so there's this strange way in which what seems free to you is actually leeching away somebody's living in the future. If you're not a translator, then it's not yours, but something similar will be happening to you about some other thing in some other domain eventually. And what we have to understand is that this thing called automation is always theater. It's never real. It's always a way of repackaging human labor in a different form. And the only question is whether we acknowledge that there were really people there behind the curtain that made it possible, or if we pretend they don't exist. If we're willing to accept that people are really there and find a way to pay them, what I believe is that we might find a new solution to the age-old problem of how to deal with having a fair society that doesn't have poverty, that has a variety of outcomes where people can still invent themselves, invent their way without some socialist committee telling them what to do. How can you get all that stuff at once? And so what I'm arguing is that through more complete accounting in a high-tech economy, an information economy, if we just keep track of all the ways that people are contributing to these giant data sets, we might be able to create a middle class naturally just by being honest about what everybody's contributing, instead of by imposing some sort of, like I say, a socialist committee or some sort of wealth redistribution. I think we might be able to just get it naturally if we're just willing to acknowledge the truth.
So let me flesh this out for listeners. So what you're saying is every time we exchange anything, we may be providing some value to some server, to some, for instance, even you say, if the government camera on a corner catches you walking by and then it uses that in a match search sometime, you would be owed a little micro payment of money because you contributed information. And the translation one seems a little clearer, but you're saying that every time we do something. So now what this depends on, I read an interview you did with Stephen Cherry, in which he said it depends on no copying and two-way links. Is that pretty clear?
Yeah, well, that gets a little technical, and
don't take it too technical then. So they're doing whatever they're doing, and what's happening is everything is tracked, which at first may make you paranoid, but it's tracked because you want to find what it ends up contributing toward.
Yeah, I mean, it's being tracked anyway, and as the more we learn about how much it's being tracked, right? So I know that there are a lot of initially skeptical reactions. If somebody's hearing this for the first time, they might think, well, surely the information for most people would have negligible value, or surely this would be too complex, and so forth.
For $20 a year or something, right?
Yeah, I know a lot of people think that, and I don't want to claim to know for sure that this would all work out, but I do want to say that I think some of the most common initial negative or skeptical reactions deserve to be scrutinized because they might not be so. For instance, in terms of the value of information from people, I've been trying to get a handle on how much an individual's information is worth right now, and it's very hard to do that. But, if you add up how much each person's data is being valued on average by various intermediate marketing companies that actually broker it, and if you add up the differential of being part of somebody else's information system versus not being, so for instance, using your frequent buyer's card at the grocery store or something like that, if you add up all the little ways that information is being valued and then you try to adjust for whatever you actually get and barter for that and see what's left, it's a lot. I mean, even I've been sort of trying to hypothesize the very most boring person with the least valuable information, and it's kind of amusing to think about who that would be, but whoever, probably some low-level executive at a development company. But anyway, whoever it is, that most boring person's data is already worth some hundreds of dollars a year at the very least, and it's going up. And at some point, as there are more and more services that make use of data, and I'm thinking maybe 10 years, something like that, maybe 15, that intrinsic value of what people contribute to the system just by being alive and being measured all the time starts to approach the poverty line. And when you start hitting that point, a new way to think about how to make a just society presents itself, once again, based on just honesty and better accounting rather than on redistribution. So I know this must leave a lot of questions unanswered, and if somebody's hearing this for the first time, I will address just one other question, which is complexity. People who think this is too complicated have no idea what's going on right now, which is just insanely stupid. I mean, I just can't, from a technical point of view, what we're doing right now is about as convoluted as could be, and I think this would actually be a simplification for various reasons, which I'm not going to go into right now, but that doesn't scare me, and that's the topic I really know about. And the other thing people have to understand is that it's not like there's some safe haven of work that's not going to get digitized away. 3D printers are coming where people would be able to create products. Like instead of buying a tablet at a store, you might just print one out, and you could print out a new printer too. So retail jobs go away, manufacturing jobs go away. Driving jobs go away because the vehicles are driving themselves. You might think human helping professions like being a masseuse or a nurse or something, those will never go away.
But Sherry Turkle, half of her book, Alone Together, is about the role of robots, and a lot of it has to do in healthcare and companionship and so on.
Yeah. So I make the case in my book, too, that we shouldn't, I mean, I don't know what'll happen exactly, but I think especially in the lower segments of the economy, robotic healthcare is not unimaginable at all. We've already seen robotic legal researchers outperform human researchers. We're seeing the rise of these massive online courses, which could absolutely destroy the academic world, with the exception of the brand name places like the Stanfords. I guess, I should name some. LA has good universities too, but anyway.
That's okay.
No, actually I have an appointment at USC, so I'm I'm not. But anyway, the thing is, nobody's safe. There's no form of human labor that's safe from this trend. So we really do need a solution to it.
Let me ask you one last question, really, which is that I think as I've looked around, reviews of your book are positive and so on. Within the industry, within the ones who would have to say, we may have to turn in this direction, what sort of responses have you gotten from those ends, from those circles?
One thing I want to say is that there's a lot of positivity in Silicon Valley, and people are open-minded because a lot of us are technocrats, and if they're interested in whether what I'm proposing could work or not, and there are good intentions and there's an open-heartedness, and there are a lot of very positive qualities. So, yeah, there's a few cranky people who think I'm going to destroy the world with these ideas, but very few. I mean, most of the people, and particularly successful ones, are very open-minded about it. I mean, I'm not anti-success. I think that people like Elon Musk or Sergey Brin are great. I think we need those people, and I'm not anti them, so they know I'm not an antagonist. For God's sakes, I sold a company to Google myself. I'm not like...
And you work for Microsoft.
And yeah, I'm working with Microsoft. One of my old companies is part of Oracle, another one's part of Pfizer. I'm totally part of this community. I love it, so I'm not some alien attacker. So, I mean, the question people have is, do I really have enough on the table to propose an alternative? And, I'm getting there. I'm not claiming I have all the answers. You should be very suspicious of anybody who claims to have perfect knowledge of the future. But, I think I have part of an answer. I think I really am ready to make that claim.
And one of the things that you pointed out in a previous answer is that most people do not know what's going on behind the curtain now. And that, not that people should have to learn to figure that out, but that a lot of what you're proposing could easily happen behind the curtain, just as what's happening now is happening.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, I think we really missed an opportunity because, people are mostly pretty good-natured and are willing to give a lot of different things a try, at least at first. And I think if we proposed a way for people to participate in an economy that would grow the economy instead of shrink it, which is what I believe what we're doing right now, I think a lot of people would give us the benefit of the doubt and take a dive and try it. There's this sort of idea that nobody would ever be willing to make this transition once they're used to free treats to a world where they might be paying for things. And I agree that might be tough. In the book, I propose a thing I call an economic avatar. An economic avatar would be a sort of a way to experience the old economy for a while until you're doing well enough in the new economy to make a transition. So, basically we use a little bit of trickery. And the thing is, the economy is based on trickery to begin with because human cognition kind of doesn't work naturally with honest economics. So therefore we're awash in ideas like sales, which are it's a nonsensical idea. It doesn't mean anything. It's just whatever the price is, right? But we have this idea of a sale, or we have this idea of a bargain. We have all of these weird tricks we play on ourselves just in order to be able to have an economy in the first place. And something like that is probably going to be needed to make any kind of transition to a sustainable digital economy.
Okay, and that's our hope. So again, the book is Who Owns the Future? The website is JaronLanier.com, JaronLanier.com. Thank you, Jaron Lanier. Keep up the good work.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Very welcome. For this week's conversation and many other interviews, articles, transcripts of interviews, and to join me in pursuit of a world that just might work, go to TerenceMcNally.net, TerenceMcNally.net, or aworldthatjustmightwork.com. They're the same website if you want to receive my weekly email announcement telling you who's going to be on, what we're going to talk about, 4 or 5 articles of background. Sign up at my site or email me at temcnally@mac.com. You can also subscribe and listen to the Free Forum podcast on iTunes. Thanks to G, my engineer, Stan Mizrahi in production, and to you, my listeners. I look forward to being with you again next week.